Our next presenter is Professor Earl Schwartz, who is going to lead us in our interfaith text study. So please welcome Earl.
Thank you, Sarah. Good evening, friends. From the inception of our gatherings, we've concluded each learning session with a bit of time gathered around the study of texts and traditions sacred to our communities. And this evening, I have the pleasure to doing that with you. My topic for the evening is related to the fine learning that we've been involved in all evening. Specifically, with the Hebrew Bible's understanding of the relationship between land and human need. Though they're very different in important ways, land ownership is a foundational feature of both feudal and liberal social systems. Liberal theory was historically a reaction against feudal oppression. But liberalism rejected limiting land ownership to a particular caste or a class, not to ownership of land per se. But biblical sources dealing with land holdings differ profoundly from both feudal and liberal models. And I'd like to study a passage from the Hebrew Bible with you this evening that deals directly with those differences. It's the 25th chapter of the book of Leviticus, which touches on the question of how the members of this new covenanted community of biblical Israel would deal with the notion of land holdings. The surrounding narrative suggests that the only previous social experience of those now receiving this new covenantal land law had been in Pharaoh's Egypt, with its system of royal ownership of all the land, abetted, ironically, as the biblical narrative tells it, by the Israelites' own ancestor, Joseph. A feudal system headed by a human god. More specifically, Leviticus chapter 25 deals with the sabbatical and jubilee cycles through which debts were canceled and the original egalitarian allotment of land use was periodically reinstated. I say land use rather than reallotment of the land itself, because as the passage indicates, as we'll see in just a moment, the buying and selling of land wasn't understood as purchasing the land per se, but its potential harvests. Let's look a little more closely at the text. We have it in front of you, a few verses that I've chosen from the chapter that deal directly with this issue. As you can see, verses 15 and 16 indicate your purchase price from your fellow is determined by counting the number of years that have elapsed since the Jubilee, since the last redistribution of the land. It's sold to you according to the number of harvest years. The more years, the more you raise the purchase price. The less years, the more you lower the purchase price, because it's the number of harvests he's selling you. And then at the close of the chapter, and in order to make this unmistakably clear, the text ends, you will not permanently sell any land, because the land, God says, the land is mine. It's because you're sojourners, you're migrating, You're passing through. You're temporarily residing with me. In all of your holdings, you will give the land its redemption. So reads the text. Now, if that poses interesting challenges for the way in which you and I have been acculturated to what it means to own land, I would like to sharpen that contrast a little more by going back to a formative text in liberal thought that is foundational to the way in which land ownership is typically thought of in American society. This comes from John Locke's second treatise on government, the section of property, passage number 32. Locke was a bright guy. He was highly influential. But as you'll see in a moment, he read his scripture rather selectively, or perhaps too hastily. After explaining that property becomes ownable when someone invests their effort in owning it, he then goes on to say, but the chief matter of property being now not the fruits of the earth and the beasts that subsist on it, but the earth itself, as that which takes in and carries with it all the rest. I think it's plain that property in the land, too, is acquired as the former. He that in obedience to this command of God, and here Locke uses a string of references that are scriptural, the command of God to subdue and till and sow any part of it, thereby annexed it to something that was his property, which another had no title to, nor could without injury take from him. In other words, Locke seems to be saying, I think the Bible tells me that if I work a piece of land, if I invest in a piece of land, if I claim a piece of land, it becomes my property as much as anything on the land might be potentially mine as well. The contrast is stark, which leads to two questions that I'd like to pose. One that I would briefly begin to talk with you about altogether, and then suggest that you take into your small groups for continued reflection, as well as a second. The first question, the central figures of the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament are repeatedly described as being gerim, the Hebrew word for sojourners, people who find themselves in a particular place but don't enjoy the full rights of citizenship or of being native born. Biblical figures are repeatedly described as being in such a condition. What does that central theme of the Hebrew Bible, that the great figures of Scripture are passing through, suggest to you regarding what it means to be human? Let's start with that question. Any initial thoughts? What might this central theme of Old Testament literature, which is consistent through all of Old Testament literature, that the great figures of biblical tradition are people who somehow find themselves in a place and must make where they are their home, even if it's not theirs to claim? What does that suggest about what the biblical text is indicating regarding what it means to be human? Any initial thoughts? does it mean to suggest that unlike other great ancient traditions in which the heroes, the central figures, the pivotal characters of their narrative are the people of the place, biblical characters are continually described as being out of place. And in the text that we have above from Leviticus, that every Israelite is to imagine themselves in that condition. What does that seem to suggest about what it means to be human? Any initial thoughts? I see in the chat a couple. We're responsible to leave it useful for the next sojourner, perhaps as stewards. Yes, I think the notion of stewardship certainly stems to a great extent from this strain of biblical tradition. Thank you, Chris. And Sally, we're in transit. It simply is coming to grips with what mortal means. The earth does not belong to us, we belong to the earth. Yes, we often identify that notion with other traditions, but it's firmly rooted in the biblical tradition as well. And that to the extent, perhaps, Sally, if I could expand on this, we surround ourselves with ways of mitigating that mortality by saying, I own this thing, I've got some security in this possession. We're simply fooling ourselves about what it means to be human. And Randy, humanity is being who we are in the face of great difficulty, not in the place of comfort, having to adapt, listen to, learn from those who happen to be around us. But yes, thank you, Randy, that's the truth of what it means to be human. And to think otherwise is to lose touch with the reality around us. I would like to ask that you please join around your tables, as it were, for a few minutes to talk about this a bit more, and then a second question, if you'd like. As we learn elsewhere in Leviticus, not only is land not subject to outright ownership, but also the corners of one's fields and dropped and left behind portions of a harvest, which, though seemingly a part of one's own harvest, are, according to Leviticus, to be treated as the property of poor people and sojourners. What would you say are strengths of the classical liberal approach to ownership of land? And what might be the weaknesses of this way of looking at the world around us? A more direct comparison of what these biblical texts suggest and the highly influential thinking of people like Locke regarding what it means to own property. So with that, please, Sarah, if we can break into small groups for perhaps about 5 minutes.
I will open the rooms up. We're going to go for 5 minutes.
Thank you.
Welcome back. I think folks are coming back here. I'm looking, yep. Earl's back, perfect. Earl, do you want to do a little closing?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I want to thank my small group for our conversation. If we had a bit more time, I'd be eager to hear of other conversations as well. But let me just close in this way, and I hope that it's appropriate for each of our conversations. It's possible that for migratory peoples, it might not be so difficult to do without the idea of owning land. But the Israelites, though they were originally migrants, would eventually become a settled people. And yet, as we see in the text that we study tonight, they're called to understand that seemingly settled status in a larger sense, and that in fact, they remain, in essence, sojourners in the world. From God's lips to our ears. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Earl.
Thank you, Earl.
You're welcome.
Amen.
Earl. And I just want to take this moment, I'm going to throw back to Sarah in a second, but I want to take this moment to thank Earl for this wonderful teaching tonight and for leading our interfaith text study curriculum always. No matter who the presenter is, Earl is knitting the curriculum together and choosing the teachers. And Earl, you make Opportunity St. Paul what it is. Thank you so much.
My great honor and pleasure. All the best to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. Thank you, Earl. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming out and joining us on Zoom for Earth Day. I hope your discussions were fruitful, and I hope you got an opportunity to learn something new. I know I certainly did. We'll have another learning community event coming up here in May, so watch for more information. And as always, please feel free to reach out with any questions, and we'll post the recording link on our website as soon as we get it back. But may you all be well and stay safe and healthy. Thanks for coming tonight. Bye now.